In 1829, Andrew Jackson entered the White House with bullets still lodged in his chest. A velvet pouch was later found at the Hermitage Hearth. Inside, a dueling token, a broken pipe, a half-burned letter. It was signed only, "To the man you will never meet," whose story was never finished. A scorched pipe, a blood-stained ledger, a letter, unread. Born in 1767, Jackson fought duels, defied courts, and crushed nations. But his archives left gaps. Objects survived where names did not. When power was absolute, what else was consumed in fire? Welcome to History's Ledger. Tonight, we open the story of Andrew Jackson, not the portrait in oil or the title etched into textbooks, but the fragments left behind. A scorched pipe, a blood-marked ledger, a velvet pouch found near the hearth, stitched with silence that spoke louder than any speech. Jackson's life was contradiction, a populist who owned more than 160 enslaved people, a war hero who crushed nations, a self-styled defender of liberty who jailed judges and banned abolitionist mail. His scandals weren't just policy, they were objects and absences, scars and silences. So we begin, not in the court or on the battlefield, but here, in a room. The Hermitage in Tennessee was more than a plantation. It was Jackson's seat of power. His study still stands. Floorboards creak beneath your feet. Light spills from tall windows across a desk, carved of cherry and streaked with pale pearl. That desk bears knife marks near the blotter, scored by a restless hand. Ink stains the wood. A wax seal sits on the rim of a frayed inkwell. The scent here is cedar and tobacco, dulled by time. And then, the hearth, brick-lined, blackened from decades of fire. After Jackson's death in 1845, a velvet pouch was found pressed into a seam near the base. The fabric was sooted, but the contents held. A dueling token, a watch engraved CD, and a letter fragment, burned to its upper edge, its opening line intact. "To the man you will never meet." The rest had fallen to ash. No family record mentions it. No archivist matched the handwriting. Some say it was tied to Charles Dickinson, the man Jackson killed in a duel in 1806. Dickinson had accused him of cowardice and insulted his wife. The duel ended in blood. Dickinson fired first. The ball shattered Jackson's ribs. Jackson stayed standing and fired back. Dickinson died. Jackson carried that bullet in his chest for the rest of his life. Could the letter have come from him or from someone else entirely? The pouch mattered. Jackson surrounded himself with French waistcoats, Venetian chandeliers, imported rugs, symbols of grace. But within reach, he kept fire, dueling relics, scorched pipes, half-burned letters. His home gleamed above the mantel, but smoldered near its base. Stand in the room today, and the silence has weight. A crack crosses the portrait above the fireplace, right through the eye. The floor chills beneath your hand. Open a drawer, and paper breathes dust and iron ink. The objects that remain tell no polished tale. They speak in fragments. They do not explain. Jackson's presidency became a storm of scandals. But before the courts, before the war, before the vetoes, there was this Hearth, and a letter that said only, "To the man you will never meet," or the pouch the fireplace tried to hide. May 30th, 1806. The field at Harrison's Mill in Kentucky was damp with last night's rain. The scent of wet earth clung to boots. Two men faced each other, 24 feet apart, pistols in hand, no words spoken. Andrew Jackson was 39. He wore a dark wool coat, high-collared, a silk cravat tight at his throat. Across from him stood Charles Dickinson, age 32, younger, sharper, known across the state as a marksman. The duel was said to be over a horse bet, but it wasn't. Dickinson had called Rachel Jackson, Andrew's wife, a bigamist, a public insult too deep to ignore. The second stepped aside. Dickinson fired first. The shot hit Jackson in the chest. It shattered 2 ribs. The bullet tore through muscle and lodged near his heart. He swayed, but didn't fall. Blood spread beneath his coat, soaking the laurel embroidery at his cuff. Jackson raised his pistol, took aim, and fired. Dickinson collapsed. He would die within hours. Jackson lived, but he carried that bullet for the rest of his life. For 39 more years. Surgeons feared to touch it. Cold weather made him cough blood. The pain would sometimes drop him to a chair. But he kept the bullet, called it a badge of honor, never complained. The duel became legend, but the pattern started there. Jackson would challenge or be challenged in over 100 duels and near duels throughout his life, over politics, debts, pride, sometimes for cause, sometimes for the echo of the last. Years later, in a drawer at the Hermitage, historians found a blood-spotted ledger. The ink listed pistols, powder, shot. No one could confirm where the blood had come from, but the page never let go of it. Imagine the air that morning, black powder thick in the lungs, damp grass, a shot that cracked the sky, and Jackson, standing with blood pooling beneath his ribs, lifting his arm, steadying his hand, not to defend, but to finish. What kind of man survives that moment? What kind of man needs to? He wore French-cut waistcoats, ate beneath chandeliers, sat at polished tables etched with mother of pearl. But he also slept with pistols near his bed and kept dueling tokens in a velvet pouch by the hearth. The bullet stayed in his chest. So did the code. And every time the cold came and the pain returned, did he remember the insult or the silence between the shots? The year was 1814, Horseshoe Bend, Alabama. The Tallapoosa River curled like a blade. The air hung thick with mist. Andrew Jackson stood among cannon crews, boots caked with red clay, the bullet from 1806 still lodged in his chest. He was 47, thin from illness, stiff from old wounds. His voice still cut like steel. The Creek Nation had fortified the bend with logs and trenches. Jackson's orders came quick. Artillery fired. Smoke smothered the trees. By sundown, over 800 Muskogee Creek warriors lay dead. The ground churned with blood and river water. It was the final blow in a war meant to clear land for settlers. A war Jackson would call a necessity. Washington called it victory. He signed the Treaty of Fort Jackson months later, August 1814. 23 million acres of Creek land were ceded to the U.S., over half of Alabama and a large piece of Georgia. The ink barely dried before settlers arrived. In his tent, maps spread across a scarred table. Red ink traced new borders. The lamps smoked faintly. Officers dined on hard biscuits and salt pork. Jackson sat in silence, eyes on the rivers now changed by signature. Outside, the cries of the wounded faded into the trees. At the Hermitage, a letter later surfaced. He had written to Rachel, "The enemy is scattered. One half must starve and die with disease." The tone, as cold as the ink. The victory made him a national hero. Old Hickory, the general who could not be broken. His portrait began appearing in shop windows. But for the Muskogee, the name they used was Sharp Knife. Even his own troops feared his temper. Orders were given through clenched teeth. Punishments came without pause. One officer wrote, "He bends only to fire." Back in Tennessee, refinement softened the scene. At the Hermitage, Jackson walked on indigo-dyed rugs, drank from crystal, and wrote letters beneath chandeliers. His desk held maps and medals. It also held silence. There's no journal entry on the cost of those acres. No reckoning with the dead. Only a quill and a red line on a map. The fragments remain. A blood-smudged page from a field ledger. A knife with initials etched faintly on its hilt. Soil samples dug from beneath the bend still hold ash. So when we call him a hero, do we mean the portrait in uniform? The fields near Chalmette, just outside New Orleans, were soaked with swamp fog. Damp hung in the wool coats of soldiers. The Mississippi hissed quietly beyond the trench lines. Andrew Jackson, age 47, declared martial law weeks earlier. The city now answered to him alone. Courts silenced. Civilians watched. Cannons rolled into place behind cotton bales, wet, sagging, but heavy enough to stop a shot. By dawn, redcoats appeared through the mist. A wall of men in polished boots, bayonets bright. Drums beat once. Then the air cracked. American cannons roared. Within 2 hours, over 2,000 British soldiers were dead or wounded. Jackson lost fewer than 100. The lines held. Smoke filled every breath. The field was still. The victory arrived after the war had technically ended. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed in December 1814. But news traveled slowly. Jackson didn't know. Neither did the British. But it didn't matter. The nation crowned him a savior. Church bells rang. Newspapers hailed him as Old Hickory. Songs were written, toasts raised. His portrait circulated faster than the news of peace. In New Orleans, salons filled with crystal glasses and whispers of legend. A woman in velvet claimed she'd seen history. A harp played softly behind her, but Jackson's grip didn't loosen. Even after the battle, martial law remained. When Louisiana Senator Louis Louis criticized him in print, Jackson had him arrested. When Judge Hall ordered his release, Jackson jailed the judge too. Power didn't pause with victory. Back at headquarters, Jackson wrote orders by candlelight. The room smelled of wool, blood, and ink. His cravat was stained. His eyes, brighter in silence than in speech. Years later, in a trunk at the Hermitage, a silk cravat was found. Ash darkened at the edges. Next to it, a sealed letter, cracked wax. Inside, a warning. General, remember the law in triumph. It was never open. So what lingers longer? The field where rifles fell silent, or the prison door closed on a judge? Would you toast him with crystal under chandeliers, or remember the quiet sound of rights suspended beneath the stars? Inside the east room of the White House, lamplight flickered against chandeliers strung with cut crystal. The air was thick with beeswax, tobacco, and fresh ink. A quill rested in its glass inkwell beside a folded document, newly passed by Congress, waiting for one name. Andrew Jackson signed it slowly, his hand pressing hard enough to bleed the ink. The year was 1830, and the document was the Indian Removal Act. On paper, it looked like policy. In practice, it was exile. Treaties were redrawn, boundaries erased. Surveyors spread out across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Entire nations, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, were now marked for removal. In Tennessee, the Hermitage held its own rhythm. Imported rugs cushioned footsteps across polished floors. Silver utensils bore Jackson's initials. A ballroom trimmed with chandeliers stood ready, though rarely used. And yet, in that same house, letters arrived instructing surveyors where to draw new lines, which roads to use, how much force would be permitted. One note from Jackson to a military agent survives. It ordered the arrest of a woman who had tried to delay her departure. She will be punished for obstruction. The ink is faint, but firm. That fall, wagons began to move. By the winter of 1831, the first Choctaw families marched westward, forced to leave in snow, crossing frozen rivers without enough blankets or food. 4,000 would not survive. A missionary described children wrapped in shawls too thin to keep out the cold, their mothers pushing forward in silence. Inside the White House, music still played. Jackson hosted dinners beneath chandeliers, the walls lined with velvet drapes, glasses filled with Madeira. Outside, the roads thickened with frost and the silence of footsteps. The Cherokee called it Nunna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. We call it the Trail of Tears. In a letter to Congress, Jackson wrote, "They will go in peace and comfort." He never walked beside them. One fragment remains in a private archive, a child's carved comb, found buried near the Arkansas River. The teeth are worn, the wood faintly stained. No name, just presence. The Indian Removal Act reshaped the nation. It opened millions of acres for white settlers. It fulfilled a vision Jackson had held since his earliest campaigns, land for the people, and the people he chose to define. But what if that vision came at the cost of prayers whispered into the snow? Would you sit at that cherry wood table, sign your name in ink, and call it peace? Or would you stop before the pen touched paper, hearing, just faintly, the sound of footsteps already beginning their march? In parlors across the East Coast, brandy swirled in crystal glasses. The year was 1832, and the papers were filled with one name, Jackson. He had vetoed the re-charter of the Bank of the United States, calling it a monster. To him, it was a gilded engine for elites, a fortress of paper promises and privilege. But to merchants and bankers, it was the foundation of credit. They looked at ledgers, at loans extended, land bought, trade secured, and saw the pulse of a growing nation. Jackson didn't care. From his desk in the White House, the same cherrywood slab inlaid with mother of pearl, still marked by ink rings and knife scratches. He signed the veto with deliberate force. The ink soaked deeply. The Constitution, he insisted, did not protect institutions born of inequality. The next year, he ordered federal deposits removed from the bank entirely, scattering them into pet banks loyal to his administration. It wasn't just a financial act, it was a political strike. The vaults in Philadelphia dimmed. Their gold would now move at his command. Imagine a drawing room in New Orleans. A merchant pours wine with a shaking hand. His accounts are frozen, loans withheld. A japanned box of sovereigns, once buried beneath velvet, is now open nightly. Coins counted in silence. In Charleston, silver forks are packed away. In Boston, rugs once walked by senators are auctioned alongside clocks and crystal. Credit collapses in whispers. By 1837, the panic becomes reality. Land speculators lose everything. Crops rot unsold. Shops close. A banker's ledger survives from that spring, with lines crossed out in thick ink, debts defaulted, names struck through. The note in the margin simply reads, "Gone." Jackson had already left office by then. At the Hermitage, he walked slowly through rooms still gleaming with French wallpaper and ormolu clocks. The panic he ignited rolled on without him. His cane clicked softly against imported rugs. Did he feel regret or resolve? One letter from the period quotes him plainly. "The bank is dead. I have done my duty in his study." A drawer held gold coins stacked in velvet-lined cases. Not promises, Metal, real, cold, tangible. So what do we call this? Or a war fought against shadows, with lives lost in the smoke? Or reached for the coin in the dark? Perfect. I'll continue in full immersive mode, slow-paced and cinematic, with elegant sensory layering, natural date placement, and symbolic objects throughout. Next up, Chapter 7, The Spoils of Office, reduced by 20%, but fully in line with history's ledger voice. Stand by. It's coming next. The boots hit marble. It was March 1829, and the White House had never seen a crowd like this. Men in mud-caked shoes and frayed jackets surged through the gates. Women in bonnets crushed against wrought iron. Children climbed the steps. Inside, candles flickered in chandeliers, catching crystal in fractured bursts. The scent of polish still clung to the parlor floor, but soon it vanished, replaced by sweat, smoke, and the rind of crushed cheese ground into velvet. Jackson had just been sworn in. The crowd called him the people's president, and now the people were in his house. Silver trays wobbled in trembling hands, porcelain shattered. A wheel of cheese cracked and slumped onto the carpet, the brine rising sharp and sour. Boots smeared mud across damask. Punch spilled. A woman fainted near the wall. One vase toppled from the mantel and shattered across the hearth. Jackson slipped out the back, down a garden path slick with spring rain, his coat trailing damp. Inside, the celebration raged on without him. The next morning, the reckoning began. Upholstery stained, drapes torn, china lost, furniture marred by heel prints and spilled wine. The scent of cheese lingered in the fibers. He requested funds, $50,000, to refurbish. But that wasn't all he replaced. 900 federal workers were dismissed within the year. Postmasters, clerks. Their ledgers neat, their reputations long-standing. Loyalty mattered more. Names were crossed out, letters sealed with wax and finality. In Boston, a postmaster packed his desk in silence. In New York, a customs officer returned to find a stranger in his chair. The room still smelled of ink and old coats, but the men who had filled them were gone. And the new ones arrived, tavern owners, editors, loyalists from the campaign trail. One man who had poured ale for voters in Tennessee now carried the federal seal. Inside the White House, the chandeliers were cleaned, the cheese scrubbed from the rug. New curtains hung in the windows. The forks glinted again, Jackson's initials engraved into the handles. This, he said, was democracy, a rotation of office, the will of the people made real. But critics called it something else, a spoils system, government turned reward. In the Hermitage archives, one letter survives. A dismissed clerk wrote, "The pen was lifted, and my years vanished with the stroke." Power had shifted, not with violence, but with silence. So what would you remember? The gavel cracked. Inside the Supreme Court chamber, Chief Justice John Marshall read the decision in Worcester versus Georgia. The year was 1832. The court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign, that Georgia had no right to seize its land. The ink on the ruling was still wet when Georgia ignored it, and Jackson, seated in the White House behind velvet drapes and silver engraved pens, refused to enforce it. He is said to have muttered, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it." Whether or not he said the words, the meaning lived in what followed. The Cherokee appealed. Letters were sent. Delegates arrived in Washington and left with promises, not protection. Meanwhile, Georgia surveyed the land, moved troops into Cherokee territory, and began to divide what was not theirs. At the Hermitage, Jackson read the reports with measured calm. Outside, the grounds shimmered, magnolias in bloom, curtains billowing through tall windows. Inside, his desk filled with petitions and maps. He signed none of the pleas. The trail westward was already drawn. Soldiers came to Cherokee homes in 1838. Some arrived at night, others in broad daylight. Doors were knocked in, families pulled from beds, fields abandoned, churches left behind. The air turned colder than expected. They walked west, 16,000 Cherokee, most on foot. Over 4,000 would die before they reached Indian territory. The trail bore no markers, just the sound of coughing children, the creak of frozen wagon wheels, the wet sound of snow turned to mud. Women carried infants, wrapped in quilts too thin for frost. Graves were dug shallow, the ground too hard to cut deep. Inside Washington parlors, the chandeliers glowed. Wine swirled in crystal. Senators raised toasts to expansion. A man near the fireplace praised the law for civilizing the wilderness. He likely never looked out the window that evening. One missionary kept a line in his journal. They whispered prayers in the snow. Some sang he did not record names, just silence between entries. Years later, a small carved necklace, bone, not gold, was found along the road. The cord was broken. The name of the child who wore it is lost. The object remembers more than the ledger, and the court's ruling, still valid in ink, faded in power the moment it touched the wind. So what speaks louder now? The parchment in a law library, or the footprints pressed into frozen earth? The music played softly behind the drapes. In Washington, the chandeliers glowed as if nothing cracked beneath the surface. Yet by late 1832, tension pulsed in every parlor, not from foreign wars, from within. South Carolina had declared its right to nullify federal tariffs, to unmake federal law. At the center of the storm stood John C. Calhoun, Jackson's vice president. He believed sovereignty rested with the states, that a state could choose what to obey. In Charleston, merchants applauded. Militias began to drill. Drums echoed in muddy fields where cotton once stood unchallenged. At the White House, Jackson read Calhoun's words beneath a cut glass lamp. The parchment trembled slightly in his grip, not from fear, but from fury. According to witnesses, he muttered something sharp as flint. "If he secedes his state, I will secede his head." He prepared for war, quietly, with precision. Troops were ordered to Fort Sumter. Warships moved toward Charleston Harbor. Cannons were polished, loaded, oiled. The scent of iron and tar thickened the air near the docks. In the East Room, receptions continued. Men bowed, women curtsied. But the music seemed off-tempo, as if the violinist could feel the tension in the president's clenched hands. Calhoun resigned. He descended from the vice presidency into the Senate, where he sharpened his pen and kept his fire. His alliance with Jackson, once uneasy, now snapped. A compromise came, brokered by Henry Clay. Tariffs were lowered. South Carolina backed down, but the warning remained like smoke that never clears. One unsigned note, found later in a desk drawer, read, "The president does not bluff. He loads before he speaks." Jackson had ignored the Supreme Court when it suited him. But when the Union was threatened, law became sacred. He would not let it splinter. Was that conviction or convenience? Imagine sitting in a ballroom that winter, candlelight reflected in crystal, laughter in corners. But somewhere beyond the windows, cannons waited, silent and gleaming. Would you have toasted compromise, or watched Jackson's finger tighten near the trigger? Just outside Nashville, the Hermitage rises with quiet precision. Pale brick, white columns, curtains of red damask softened by time. Inside, everything gleamed. Velvet chairs, French wallpapers, silver forks bearing the initials, A.J. chandeliers from Venice, shimmered above imported rugs. A house built to reflect order, but not far from that polished front door, a different life continued. The cabins stood in rows, wood darkened by smoke, chimneys puffing slow spirals of ash. By the time Jackson died in 1845, 161 enslaved people lived and labored on this land. Cotton fields stretched outward in waves. Voices carried softly, prayers, work songs, the rustle of corn leaves in wind. The scent of ash clung to fabric. The days began in darkness and ended the same. Inside the mansion, guests dined from porcelain tureens. Madeira warmed in crystal. The ballroom, though seldom used, remained set. Rugs brushed, mirrors polished. No one recorded the names of the women who prepared the meals, only the menus. Jackson's letters do not avoid his brutality. In one, he ordered punishment for a woman named Betty for putting on airs. In another, he offered extra payment to any man who captured an enslaved boy, with a bonus for delivering lashes. The handwriting is neat, the tone cold, and yet portraits show him with solemn grace, seated calmly, hand on cane, eyes framed in oil as though carved in restraint. They don't show the people who built the floor beneath his boots. Archaeologists later found graves No markers, just rows of sunken soil at the edge of the estate. In one, a child's shoe, leather soft, laces missing, no inscription, but presence. Today, tourists stand in the parlor. They speak in hushed voices. They admire the chandeliers. Few wander to the caverns. Fewer still kneel in the grass where bones rest unnamed. So what remains louder? The ink had barely dried. In late 1836, President Jackson issued the Specie Circular, a decree that land could no longer be bought with paper. Only gold, only silver, real coin, real weight. He believed in metal, not promises. But paper was what held the country together. Mortgages, ledgers, banknotes, handwritten IOUs folded in jacket pockets. In the months that followed, banks trembled, credit thinned, merchants hesitated, and by May of 1837, it collapsed. A letter from a New York banker survives. The counters are empty. Men ask for coin, and I can give none. His handwriting slants as if hurried, ink blotches near the seal. Shops shuttered, crops rotted, prices doubled. 1 in 3 businesses failed. In Charleston, mahogany tables were carried to auction. In Philadelphia, silver teapots once used for guests were traded for bread. Even rugs, once symbols of success, were unrolled onto auction house floors like offerings. Inside counting houses, the air smelled of sweat, ink, and ink erasure. Ledgers filled with crossed-out names, debts called in full. A line in one simply reads, "Gone." And Jackson? He had already left Washington. At the Hermitage, he walked between rooms where chandeliers still gleamed and portraits still watched. His cane tapped against imported wood. Letters from ruined merchants arrived in stacks. He rarely answered. To him, the death of the Bank of the United States was victory, necessary, righteous, final. The panic was, in his eyes, a storm sent to cleanse. But the storm hit homes more than vaults. In one Boston archive, a fragment survives, a letter from a widow. "We pawned my husband's watch today. It paid for flour. There is no more credit. The note ends with a stain, maybe water, maybe something heavier. What do we remember? The gold locked in drawers at the Hermitage, or the paper that curled in the hands of men who trusted a promise too long?" Spring, 1829. Washington smelled of damp brick, wet wool, and fresh paint. Andrew Jackson had just entered office. The portraits were rehung, the furniture reupholstered, and the dismissals had begun. Clerks, postmasters, customs officials, men who'd served for decades, were replaced. 900 by year's end, 400 postmasters alone. Their ledgers were neat, their records clean. But loyalty mattered more than experience. Inside the post office department, a clerk reached for his pen. The page before him was half filled, tallies of postage, a list of rural routes. A messenger arrived, a sealed letter. Inside, a signature, a dismissal. The pen was placed gently beside the inkwell, the ledger left open. That night, a stranger sat in his place. Jackson called it reform, a rotation in office, democracy in motion. But in practice, it was something else. A reward system carved from power. Offices became currency. Appointments handed to editors, tavern keepers, friends from the campaign trail. A man who once poured whiskey for voters in Nashville now handled federal seals. Another who ran a newspaper in Kentucky now managed customs in Baltimore. Politics had become appointment by proximity. Inside the White House, the glow continued. Chandeliers shimmered above mahogany tables. New brocade curtains muffled the wind. Guests sipped wine from cut glass goblets, engraved with Jackson's initials. The conversation, careful and clipped, swirled beneath portraits framed in gold leaf. But outside those rooms, silence lingered. In Charleston, a dismissed officer wrote in his final report, "The seal was lifted and the room no longer mine." In Boston, clerks packed drawers slowly, their footsteps echoing in marble corridors. The smell of dust, drying ink, and polished wood followed them down the stairs. One note, unsigned, found years later in a bureau drawer, read, "I served the law. I was replaced by laughter. This was the cost of loyalty, or the price of defiance." So what would you remember? The flicker of candlelight over new curtains, or the moment a door closed, softly, finally, behind a man no longer needed? It began not with a treaty or a veto, but with lace. In 1829, Margaret O'Neill Timberlake, Peggy, arrived in Washington as the new wife of Senator John Eaton, Jackson's close ally. Her first husband, a naval officer, had died at sea. The remarriage came quickly, too quickly for Washington. In parlors lit by oil lamps and shaded by velvet drapes, society women turned their backs. Fans snapped shut. Invitations vanished. At receptions, skirts swayed to avoid hers. Margaret's voice, her laugh, her refusal to vanish, all became scandal. Jackson remembered what slander could do. His late wife, Rachel, had been branded a bigamist during the 1828 campaign. He blamed her death on gossip. When society turned on Peggy Eaton, he took it personally. He defended her with fury. But not all his cabinet did. Behind the White House doors, meetings soured. Tension thickened like smoke. Wives of top officials refused to receive Mrs. Eaton. Their husbands followed suit. The lines drawn were not of policy, but of posture. John Calhoun, already drifting from Jackson, found himself deeper in shadow. Martin Van Buren, a widower, stood by Peggy and by Jackson. He hosted her at dinners, praised her in private. The gesture mattered. In rooms where politics once turned on tariffs, it now turned on seating charts and whispered exclusions. Power bent under chandeliers, not because of a bill, but because of a glance across a dinner table. By 1831, The cabinet cracked. Resignations followed. Calhoun's fall accelerated. Van Buren's rise began. One unsigned calling card remains. Cream paper, torn at the edge, faint with perfume. Found years later in the back of a White House drawer. No name, just presence denied. Was it a scandal or a strategy? A woman's laughter echoed down the marble hallways of Washington and changed the presidency. So what broke the cabinet? Not war, not money, but silk skirts brushing cold marble and a name refused at the door. Summer, 1835. The air in Charleston was heavy, thick with salt, smoke, and the sound of ship ropes groaning on the docks. Canvas sacks of mail arrived daily, dragged from holds that smelled of damp ink and spice. But one shipment held something else. Thousands of abolitionist pamphlets, addressed loosely, scattered among regular post. The paper was coarse, the print bold. Headlines read, "Slavery is a sin, a crime against man and God." Clerks opened the bags and froze. They smelled the ink before they saw the words. It bled sharp, black, urgent. The crowd gathered fast. Some tore pamphlets apart on sight. Others lit torches. That night, in the public square, fire swallowed the words. Bundles of tracts burned beneath oil lamps. The flame crackled in silence. Some cheered, others watched, their eyes reflecting both heat and fear. Not fear of the North, but fear of who might read these pages if they weren't destroyed. In Washington, Jackson received the news in a sealed envelope. Reports from postmasters, letters from governors, pamphlets intercepted and sent north for review. He did not hesitate. He urged Congress to censor the mail, to intercept, to suppress, to silence. He who once championed the people's voice now asked the post office to read their letters and decide what truth was too dangerous to carry. Inside southern drawing rooms, silver clinked. Gentlemen unfolded the tracts with gloved fingers, read, burned, sipped. The chandeliers above never dimmed. In the quarters outside, where enslaved families stirred in the night, the fire was just another flicker. But the words, if they slipped through, meant something more. Imagine the scene. Ink on fingers, firelight on lace, a pamphlet held briefly, then fed to flame. One scrap survived, rescued by an unknown clerk, tucked into a ledger. On it, a handwritten line. If truth must be burned, what does that make of the nation that burns it? Jackson called it preservation, order. Others called it betrayal. So what would you have done? Or read it beneath a blanket, by the light of a hidden flame? Before he was president, before the parades and portraits, Andrew Jackson was a duelist. Not once, not twice, but more than 100 times, real or nearly so. Insults became rituals, honor, a countdown. The most infamous was 1806, The Duel with Charles Dickinson. A bullet lodged near Jackson's heart. He lived. Dickinson didn't. That story stayed. But the pattern stretched far beyond. He challenged rivals for debts, for slights, for whispers. At times it seemed he needed the insult, not to avenge, but to prove he still stood. Imagine the ballroom, cut glass chandeliers overhead, rose water and tobacco in the air. Jackson in waistcoat and boots, silent in the corner. A glance, a word, a duel by morning. He carried that code into politics. On the Senate floor, his vetoes landed like pistol shots. In cabinet meetings, his silence pressed heavier than any shouted order. He once told a critic he'd rather hang him than debate him. Even at night, he slept with pistols within reach. Servants said he paced with a loaded weapon, not from fear, but familiarity. The sound of metal on floorboards was the music of his thoughts. At the Hermitage, a drawer held tokens, a broken pistol grip, a bloodied glove, silver buttons worn smooth, nothing labeled, everything remembered. In 1813, while commanding troops, he was stabbed in the shoulder during a personal feud. He nearly died. The wound never fully healed. Later, he fought with Henry Clay, not with pistols, but with words, still deadly, still sharp. The difference between battlefield and drawing room was paper thin. One surviving handbill from Nashville read, "General Jackson has challenged again. Honor will be satisfied. No outcome listed. No signature." So, was Jackson a man of principle, or a man who only knew how to bleed to make a point? Imagine a field at dawn, mist curling low, pistols loaded, boots sinking into cold soil. Jackson, rigid, waiting, not to win, but to not retreat. Would you stand across from him, 24 feet away, or turn and ask, how long can a nation follow a man who never put his weapons down? The summer of 1835 pressed heavy on Charleston. The harbor stank of salt and tar, of fish baking in the sun, of sweat rolling down the backs of dock workers. Ships arrived daily, sails sagging in the still air. Among the cargo, cotton, indigo, crates of sugar, came sacks of mail. Canvas bags, stiff with damp, carried into the post office and split open across wooden counters. Inside those bags were not just letters and receipts. There were pamphlets, dozens, hundreds, thousands, printed in the North by abolitionist societies, their paper coarse, the ink dark and bold. Slavery is a crime against man and God. The words seemed to bleed from the pages. Some carried woodcuts of men in chains, arms raised in supplication. Others quoted scripture, pressing argument into faith. The clerks hesitated. They could smell the ink, sharp and metallic, stronger than the ordinary post. They knew these words would not be delivered quietly. Within hours, a crowd pressed at the doors. Citizens rifled the sacks, pulling pamphlets from envelopes. In the square outside, fire was lit. Flames consumed stacks of abolitionist tracts, sparks rising into the hot night. The smoke carried the bitter tang of burning ink and paper, curling into windows where enslaved men and women might glimpse the glow but never see the words. Andrew Jackson, in Washington, read the reports. By then, he was in his second term, his temper no less sharp, his distrust no less fierce. He saw danger in these pages, not because of what they argued, but because of who might read them. To Jackson, the pamphlets threatened insurrection. To silence them, he urged his cabinet and the Congress to give the post office authority to intercept, to burn, to erase. The irony was stark. Jackson, who declared himself the defender of the people, turned the people's mail into a weapon of silence. Letters were no longer sacred. They became contraband if their ink carried the wrong truth. Picture the rooms where this debate took shape. Senators sat in parlors trimmed with damask, sipping from crystal tumblers, the air thick with cigar smoke. On tables of polished mahogany lay seized pamphlets, their edges singed. Men leaned forward, fingers pressing the coarse paper flat, their voices low. Could they defend free speech if it meant risking unrest? Could they suppress it without cutting at the Constitution itself? The conversation spilled into newspapers. Northern editors accused Jackson of strangling liberty. Southern papers praised the burning as an act of patriotism. In Charleston, bonfires continued, their smoke mixing with the odor of sea brine and horses. Crowds cheered, though some faces remained grim, as if cheering too loudly might draw suspicion. And in the Hermitage archives, another fragment endures. A single envelope, never posted. Its wax seal cracked but still clinging. Inside, a hand had written, "If the truth must be burned, what then becomes of us?" The ink has browned, the handwriting unsteady, no name at the bottom, no addressee on the front, only the question left. Was Jackson defending order, or was he smothering the very liberties he claimed to protect? Imagine holding one of those pamphlets in your hand, the paper rough beneath your fingers, the smell of ink clinging. Would you have thrown it into the fire, feeding the blaze, or folded it beneath your coat, risking your place to read by candlelight in the silence of your room? Tell me your thoughts. Should history remember this moment as protection or suppression? Let me know in the comments. And if these fragments of the past kept you tonight, like this video, subscribe to History's Ledger and ring the bell, so the next time we open an old page, you'll be here when the words rise again. At the Hermitage, in a parlor lined with patterned wallpaper faded by Tennessee sun, hangs a portrait of Andrew Jackson, painted in 1830 when he was already president. The canvas shows him seated stiffly, his jaw firm, his gaze unflinching. The painter captured him in French waistcoat and dark coat, every button polished, every crease exact. The background is muted, the brushstrokes softened, so that the man alone commands the eye. But stand close, and the surface tells another story. A hairline crack runs across the left eye, splitting pigment, leaving the iris faintly clouded. Visitors have whispered it looks almost like a wound, an unhealed scar revealed in paint. No record explains when the crack first appeared, perhaps from humidity, perhaps from careless handling, or perhaps from the weight of time itself. The room smells faintly of varnish and old wood, mingled with beeswax polish rubbed into the floorboards. Chandeliers hang above, their crystal pendants dusted but still glinting when the afternoon light strikes them. Beneath the portrait, a mahogany sideboard holds porcelain dishes, delicate and white, their edges gilded. An ormolu clock ticks faintly, its gilded hands inching forward with sound almost swallowed by silence. The crack draws the eye more than the laurel trim on his waistcoat, more than the polished buttons, more than the brushwork of the artist. It suggests something beneath the polish, an imperfection that refuses to stay hidden. Jackson wanted control of his image. He sat for portraits that showed him unbowed, resolute, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in presidential black. His hair was always painted wild and untamed, like a storm caught on canvas. But no brush could capture the violence that trailed him. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, the veto that crippled the bank in 1832, the threats to hang John C. Calhoun during the nullification crisis. A visitor in 1842 described the parlor as imposing. She wrote of the rugs dyed deep blue, the gilt frames catching candlelight, the air perfumed with pipe smoke, and the faint sweetness of imported brandy. Yet her notes add a line about the portrait. His face stern, though the eye seems weak. Did she notice the flaw already forming? Or was it something in his expression? A weight, a fracture invisible to the artist but visible to the world. Imagine sitting in that parlor, the fire low in the grate, the smell of charred wood drifting upward. You glance at the painting. For a moment, it seems as though the eye has shifted, as though Jackson is watching from the wall, his stare following across the room. Would you feel reverence or unease? What does the portrait reveal, and what does it hide? The chandeliers, the porcelain, the ormolu clock speak of refinement, but the crack in the eye speaks of something else, a fracture that polish cannot erase. So, which lasts longer? The elegance arranged in chandeliers, or the fissure that spreads quietly across canvas? Would you have repaired the portrait, erasing the imperfection, or left the crack, a reminder that even the strongest faces carry breaks time refuses to mend? By the early 1840s, the Hermitage had grown quieter. The corridors no longer echoed with the shuffle of aides or the quick steps of messengers. Instead, the house breathed slowly, its air heavy with pipe smoke, polished wood, and the faint perfume of damask curtains that had absorbed decades of candlelight. Andrew Jackson was aging, his body failing, yet the rooms around him still shimmered with reminders of power. On a spring evening in 1844, visitors described the dining room lit with crystal chandeliers, their pendants catching firelight and scattering it across ormolu mirrors. The long mahogany table groaned under its display, porcelain tureens filled with rich stews, silver forks etched with initials, glasses of Bordeaux red as garnet. Servants moved silently, carrying platters, refilling goblets, adjusting the candles that flickered in polished holders. The scent of roasted meat and warm bread clung to the air, mingling with wax and wine. Jackson sat at the head of the table, his frame diminished, but his presence unshaken. He leaned heavily on an ivory cane, his hands spotted, his breathing roughened by the years of wounds and sickness that had never left him. The bullet from Charles Dickinson still rested inside his chest. Another remained lodged near his arm from an earlier quarrel. Pain etched his movements, yet when he raised his glass, the room fell silent. He toasted his country. His voice cracked, but the words carried weight. Promises of union, of strength, of legacy. The guests, politicians, allies, family, raised their own glasses, the sound of crystal striking crystal ringing like chimes. For a moment, it seemed as though old Hickory still held the Republic in his fist. But outside the Hermitage walls, the world had shifted. Panic from 1837 still lingered in the countryside. The scars of removal marked the trails westward. Newspapers debated slavery with sharper tones than before. The very Union Jackson vowed to protect was already fraying. Inside, silver gleamed. Outside, cracks spread. Imagine that dining room, the flicker of candles mirrored in cut glass, the smell of Bordeaux warming in crystal bowls, the rustle of silk gowns as women shifted in their seats, the faint tick of a clock, steady beneath voices speaking of the nation's future. And at the head, Jackson, face pale, eyes still fierce. Was this power or performance? A fragment survives from that night, a dinner guest's note written hastily after leaving the Hermitage. He raised his glass and spoke as if strength had not left him. But when the toast was done, he coughed until his handkerchief showed blood. The moment lingered. The chandeliers above, their light fractured into hundreds of tiny stars, seemed to shine brighter than the man beneath them. The silver forks, polished to a mirror's edge, reflected not vitality but fragility. In June 1845, Andrew Jackson died at the Hermitage. The house was draped in black crepe, mirrors covered, chandeliers dimmed. His body lay in a coffin beneath an arch of roses, the scent of flowers thick in the air, heavy enough to mask the faint sharpness of decay. Outside, enslaved men and women stood silently, their grief unrecorded in official accounts, their names absent from the ledgers. Inside, the elite filed past in hushed tones, their boots striking polished floors, their eyes lifting to portraits that no longer moved. The final toast remained, a glass raised in grandeur, a voice breaking beneath weight, blood hidden in a handkerchief. Would you have remembered him as the hero of New Orleans, the man who defied banks and courts? Or as an old general at a table of silver, lifting a trembling glass while the world outside prepared for storms he could no longer command. If you've listened through this journey, tell me what you think in the comments. Should history honor his victories or measure the cost of his scars? Like this video if the past still speaks in fragments to you. Subscribe to History's Ledger and ring the bell so the next page waits when you're ready. At the edge of the Hermitage estate, past the manicured lawns and rows of magnolia, lies ground that was long left unnamed. No marble obelisk rises there. No engraved slabs tell of who rests beneath. Only earth, grass, and the shifting shade of cedar trees. This was the burial ground of the enslaved. Archaeologists uncovered it years after the house had become a museum. The soil gave up fragments, iron nails from coffins, clay pipe stems, broken buttons, beads once strung as necklaces, a child's small shoe, the leather cracked, its stitching loose, bones marked by years of labor, the grooves of muscles pulled until they tore. No ledgers listed their resting places, no portraits captured their faces. They endured and died in silence. Inside the Hermitage mansion, chandeliers once burned bright. The air smelled of beeswax and tobacco, of brandy poured into crystal tumblers. Jackson dined at a long mahogany table, silver forks gleaming on linen, porcelain tureens steaming with stews. Laughter of guests echoed through damask curtained parlors, ormolu clocks ticking on marble mantels. Every detail spoke of refinement. Yet a few hundred yards away, families gathered in cabins of rough-hewn wood, their fires smoke-stained, their beds straw-stuffed. The smell there was of ash and damp clay, the sound of songs whispered low at night, prayers carried on the air so softly they could not be punished. One diary line from a missionary who visited the Hermitage notes, "They bury their dead at the edge of the field. No markers, no words." His handwriting trembles across the page, ink smudged at the edges. He did not record names. Imagine standing there at dusk, the cicadas shrill in the trees, the smell of honeysuckle carried on a damp wind. Grass moves gently, but no stone interrupts it. Somewhere beneath lie mothers, children, men who worked the cotton rows until their backs bent permanent. They left no speeches, only soil. Inside, Jackson's own tomb is marble, enclosed in an ornate dome structure of white columns. Tourists still place flowers there, the scent of roses and lilies lingering. His epitaph is carved deep, letters meant to last centuries. Yet the ground beyond holds more people, more stories, without even a single carved line. Which speaks louder, the marble with its inscription, or the earth that remembers silently? In the 21st century, ground-penetrating radar confirmed dozens of graves, perhaps more. Curators placed signs, built paths, gave voice where none had been allowed. Still, the names are gone. The silence remains heavier than any stone. Would you walk past the polished marble of Jackson's resting place to stand among the unmarked graves? Would you find more truth in the chandelier's glow, or in the quiet of grass bending over bones no one was meant to count. Tell me what you think. Should history weigh more heavily on the monument in marble or on the silence beneath cedar trees? Leave your thoughts below. And if this journey carried you tonight, like this video, subscribe to History's Ledger and let the next page wait for you in stillness. In the Hermitage study, among the drawers of cherry wood and the stacks of parchment, a few fragments endure. A Turkish pipe, its stem scorched black. A dueling token rubbed smooth, the edge worn by the thumb that once held it. A letter burned across the bottom, the words halting mid-line, to the man you will never meet. These objects whisper what speeches never did. They carry the heat of anger, the weight of silence, the residue of power wielded without restraint. Jackson's marble tomb stands tall in the garden, its epitaph etched deep, but the ledger of his life is written more in fragments than in stone. Think of the chandeliers glowing in Washington ballrooms, crystal pendants scattering candlelight across silk skirts and polished boots. Think of the indigo rugs rolled out beneath silver goblets, the cut glass decanters heavy with imported wine. These luxuries gleamed even as treaties were broken, judges silenced, and thousands marched westward in winter. Step outside those rooms, and you hear something else. The shuffle of feet in mud, the slam of doors closing in emptied government offices, the cough of children carried west along the Trail of Tears, the clink of coins in counting houses as panic drained banks dry. These sounds do not make it into portraits. They survive in scraps of paper, in blood-stained ledgers, in graves without markers. So how do we weigh him? As the hero of New Orleans, the man who stared down banks, courts, and rivals? Or as the president who let silence rule where law should have spoken, whose legacy rests as much in ash and absence as in triumph? Imagine holding one of those fragments now, a token, a pipe, a letter unfinished. Would you place it in a case, polished under glass? Or would you slip it back into the velvet pouch, letting the silence close again? The last page of this ledger is not neat. It ends in questions more than answers. Perhaps that is how history itself endures, unfinished, cracked like a portrait, waiting for another hand to turn the page. If you've walked with me through these rooms of chandeliers and cabins, ledgers and silences, tell me what you think below. Should history weigh Jackson's victories or his scars? Was his power a sword that defended, or one that cut deeper than he knew? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if these fragments have carried you tonight, like this video, subscribe to History's Ledger and ring the bell, so the next time we open a page, you'll be there when the ink rises again, and when this book closes, another opens. Our next story begins not in the Hermitage, but in the aftermath of a shot in Ford's Theatre. A new business rose from tragedy, souvenirs, relics, and the strange commerce of mourning. Join me next time for the next video, The Forgotten Business, born from Lincoln's assassination. Would you have bought a fragment of history born from grief, or left it untouched, letting silence speak instead?